Hey guys, welcome back to Smith Party of Six. I'm Audriana Smith. Today I wanted to share some of my favorite reads from this past year. And to be fair, not all of them are from this past year. Some of them are also from the year before because they're some of my favorites and I wasn't doing these videos yet at that time. So anyways, go ahead and grab some coffee or tea. I've got my Bears Beats Battlestar Galactica mug today. And get cozy with me and let's talk about some books. I don't know if you've ever heard of like mother culture in the Charlotte Mason community, but it's basically what we're doing for our kids and wanting to have all of these different things to pour into them. We're also then doing for ourselves, and that's mother culture. So I try to read books from a variety of different subjects. My favorite, honestly, is probably fiction, but I try to not only read fiction. There will be a lot of fiction reads on the list today, but I have some other variants in there too. Also, really quickly, I recently designed some t-shirts. So here is one that you can actually go onto my store and purchase if you are interested. It has the Charlotte Mason motto on there with a blooming book. I will have the link for the store down in the description box. So I'm not going to share books from all of the different categories that I read from today because they're not all necessarily my favorites. I don't love every single thing that I read, but I'll share stuff from the Christian and faith category, from the parenting category, parenting and education, really kind of both, from the history category, and then my favorite for last, the fiction category. All right, so jumping right in here. One of the reads from the Christian category that I really loved was The Psalm on the Cross. It's by David Roseberry. He is Anglican, I believe, and I read this when I was attending an Anglican church, and it is a journey to the heart of Jesus through Psalm 22. So on the cross, Jesus quotes, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" which kind of would have drawn the listeners' brains back to Psalm 22, which if you go to Psalm 22, it seems very compelling that it is referring to the crucifixion. And so this book, it's not a super long read. It kind of walks you through in the days leading up to Easter, going through all of Psalm 22 kind of step by step. It was a really, really good book and I definitely recommend it. So this one from the Christian category is a little different. It's not by a very recent author. I really like to delve into different Christian groups that I myself am not necessarily a part of. And honestly, at this point in my life, I don't consider myself part of any specific denomination. Several years ago, God started kind of taking me through this journey where I've been studying different Christian groups. And the one that he has me in right now is actually Catholicism. And I'm sure that people are going to automatically turn up their nose at that and go, ugh, because I know that I definitely did. My viewpoint on Catholicism was not very charitable, but I also want to make sure that I'm never just straw manning any certain group that I tend to disagree with. And so this has probably stretched me more than anything else that I've studied so far. But with that being said, one of the things that I've been reading is the Deuterocanonical books of the Bible. So the ones that are not included in Protestant scripture, but would be included in Catholic scripture and also in Eastern Orthodox as well. So they were books that during the time of the Reformation or shortly after the Reformation were decided that maybe these aren't actually part of inspired scripture, and so they were taken out of what previously had been the Bible. I have not read all of the Deuterocanonical books yet. So far, I have read Tobit, Judith, and First Maccabees. But even if you're not interested in looking into Catholicism and seeing what different groups believe, I still think that these can be helpful books to read, just like any other Christian book that we might read that's not necessarily a part of Scripture. You don't have to believe that those are a part of Scripture to still see value in them. Next on the list, this kind of bridges the gap between the Christian category and the parenting and education category. I read Parenting by God's Promises by Joel Beeke. He is a Reformed author. I want to say that he's Presbyterian. Don't quote me on that. But this book was really helpful both for kind of like the philosophical, theological aspect of parenting and then also on the more practical side. So part 1 is Covenantal Foundations for Parenting. Part 2 is Parenting as Prophets, Priests, and Kings. Part 3 is Practical Steps for Child Rearing. And part 4, Practical Helps for Teenagers. So there's both philosophy and actual, you can do this. I always find that very helpful. And next up in the parenting and education category, this year my friend actually did a book study group, and we were reading the book For the Children's Sake. Of course, very Charlotte Mason, which I hadn't read this book before. I've read a good chunk of Charlotte Mason's first book in her education series, A Philosophy of Education. And this basically tries to condense that information, make it a little bit more accessible, because Charlotte Mason's volumes are quite lengthy. They're full of amazing information. Like, it feels like drinking from a fire hose when you are reading it. It's like I want to take notes on everything. But this kind of condenses all of the principles down and makes it a little easier to grasp. And so this was a really good one to go through if you're wanting that introduction to Charlotte Mason's philosophy without undertaking reading all of the volumes, because it's a lot. All right, so next up is the history category. I don't have an actual physical copy of the book that I'm talking about because it was borrowed. This book can also be probably slightly controversial, but I found it super interesting, and so I'm going to recommend it anyway. It's called The Real Lincoln by Thomas DiLorenzo, and it gives a very different picture of Abraham Lincoln from the one that is often portrayed to us. Of course, I'm very thankful that slavery was abolished, and yet we kind of in our culture have really propped up Abraham Lincoln as almost like this perfect type of man. And number one, I think that it's kind of dangerous to do that with any historical figures. They all have their flaws. And so this book kind of delves into some of those with Abraham Lincoln. And I'm not recommending this book from the standpoint of let's tear everything down and not care about all the stuff that came before us. Okay, so editing Audriana, popping back in for just another hot minute because I don't feel like I describe myself super well here. I am not one to disparage past presidents based on just the fact that they weren't perfect people. I think that it's important to learn that our leaders that we kind of prop up as heroes weren't perfect people, but to realize that none of us are. My main interesting point with reading that book was seeing how much states' rights actually dwindled during Abraham Lincoln's time, mostly because of the Civil War, and kind of how that shaped our nation moving forward and the strength of the federal government moving forward. So I just kind of wanted to clarify that really quick. But before I get myself into too much trouble, I will just say, go ahead and read it for yourself if you are interested in that sort of thing. All right, and finally, my favorite category, which is fiction. There are a good bit of these, just because I love it so much. So first of all, I will start out with some of the books from the Chronicles of Narnia series. I had read the first 3 books. Well, if you're going in publication order, I'd read the first 3 books in the Chronicles of Narnia series, but not the rest. And so this year I finished out the rest of the series. One of the books is not here because it's in my son's room right now. The Last Battle is not part of this, but it's one of the ones that I read. And actually, Silver Chair, I sat down and I read it in a single night. I was very motivated. I couldn't put it down. So anyways, I love these. Even though they're children's literature, I don't care. I can't recommend them enough. They're just so much fun. For the next set of books in my little fiction stack here, I had started a few years ago. I really wanted to kind of go back and read classics that I hadn't actually read yet. And through doing that, I discovered that I really love Jane Austen and other writers like her. And so I've continued to just read more of her books. So 2 that made the cut for this are Persuasion and Mansfield Park. Persuasion is probably my favorite Jane Austen novel. I do love Pride and Prejudice, but there's just something about Persuasion. I know that that's not necessarily a popular opinion and that there are lots of people who don't necessarily love Anne Elliot. And same thing with Mansfield Park. There's a lot of people who don't like Fanny in Mansfield Park. I love both of these characters. I can actually really relate to them, probably more so than I can to Elizabeth Bennet, which is why I think that I prefer Persuasion over Pride and Prejudice, even though I love the story in Pride and Prejudice. So if you love like that historical romance type of fiction, and if you haven't already read the classics like I hadn't, then these are definitely 2 that I recommend. Another that's very similar and actually is probably one of my favorite books of all time is Jane Eyre. We have like a local used bookstore that I love to frequent, and this was one of the finds there. It's a very old copy of Jane Eyre. Even though this book is decently thick, it did not take me any time at all to read this because her story was so compelling for me. And this one is not by Jane Austen. It's by Charlotte Bronte. So since I love this and it was by one of the Bronte sisters, I thought that I would also love a classic written by Emily Bronte, Charlotte's sister. I don't know how anyone reads Wuthering Heights. I'm really, really sorry if you're one of those people that like Wuthering Heights is your favorite book. I could not love it. The characters, which I have it here just to show, like this is one of my least favorites. The characters were so miserable and just made everyone else miserable, and I hated it. I thought that I would love it because you see like different quotes and stuff from Wuthering Heights and I'm like, ooh, that's a really good quote. But then actually reading them in the book itself, I'm like, this is not doing it. I recommend that you read it just for the sake of reading a classic if you're into like, again, the historical romance-ish type of fiction. If you can call this a romance, it's a very depressing one. I would give that one like a 4 out of 10 probably. Okay, and then last but not least on the list, I'm actually still currently reading this one. It's borrowed from our local public library, but I have really enjoyed the book I, Eliza Hamilton. I am a huge musical theater nerd. Like I was in theater in high school. I almost went away to college in New York City to go to theater school there. It's a whole thing. So I really enjoyed the show Hamilton. Our whole family does, but of course not everything in it is exactly historically accurate. So this has kind of like bridged the gap between actual history and like still throwing some fiction in there. The majority of things that I look up from this book to see like, did that really happen that way? The answer is yes. So I really enjoy that the author, Susan Holloway Scott, tried to at least stay close to what truly happened in history and then just added some narrative to kind of fill in gaps and connect dots and things like that. It's been a really good read. It's kind of a thicker one. The chapters are kind of longer, which for me makes it take a longer time for me to get through. I don't know. I have this thing in my brain where it's like I don't want to be forced to sit down and read for a super long time. So if the chapters are shorter, I actually read more of them at once. But if there's like a long chapter, then I'm feeling like I'm being forced to sit there and get through it, and so it takes me longer to read it. I don't know. But I really like the story, and Eliza Hamilton is a compelling historical figure. All right, but that's all that I've got for you today. If you have a book that you really enjoyed reading from this year, go ahead and drop it down into the comments. I love book recommendations, and I'm sure that some of the other people who watch the channel would also like to hear what you've enjoyed. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more content like it, and I will catch you guys next time. Bye!